When there's a matter of science, such as, is there climate change? That's a scientific question. Now, as an ordinary person, it can be very difficult because you turn on the television and you see two talking heads. One says there's climate change, the other says there isn't. And you think, well, what am I supposed to do? So two things. First of all, a lot of the responsibility here lies with journalists. That talking head on the television from the Cato Institute should not be there talking about whether or not there's climate change. If the media want to invite people to discuss what the policy response should be, then by all means, think tanks like the Cato Institute ought to have a voice at the table. But in that case, so should Greenpeace, right? I mean, the correct juxtaposition of the Cato Institute is not scientists, it's Greenpeace or NRDC or EDF, right? It's an environmental group that has a different policy answer, right?
Why? Why not?
Because it's a policy question. If we're debating policy questions, then we should be juxtaposing one policy solution against another policy solution.
Okay, small detail.
Okay.
A lot of people don't know the Cato.
Yeah, okay. All right. So you can turn on the television and you might see a very famous climate scientist, someone like Jim Hansen or Mike Mann or Ben Santer, and they'll be juxtaposed with, for example, an economist from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank based in Washington, D.C., that does not do science, but promotes free market solutions to social and economic problems. So, in my opinion, that's wrong. That man from the Cato Institute should not be on television debating whether or not there's climate change. He should not be debating the facts of science because he's not a scientist. So the journalist, the editor, the producer who invited that person on stage has done a huge disservice to all of us because now we're confused because we don't know who to believe. So if the question is a scientific question, then the experts who should be invited onto television are scientists. And if the question is essentially settled in the scientific community, and the whole point of my early work was to show that it is, not just to say it, but to show it, then there shouldn't really be being a debate. We wouldn't have a debate about whether there's gravity. We don't debate on television anymore whether there's evolution, even though there are plenty of people who reject it. We don't debate whether or not the plates move or whether or not time and space are relative when the recent discovery from the LIGO observatory, the long wavelength interferometry gravitational observational, something like that, right? You'll have to check what LIGO stands for. But when the physicists at LIGO discovered gravity waves a few weeks back, or a few months back, depending on when you'll have to edit this, but when the physicists at LIGO detected gravity waves, that was reported all over the press, and it was reported as a great scientific discovery. And no one put on television some guy from the Cato Institute saying, oh, we don't believe it, we don't believe in gravity waves. But the reason why there was no one from the Cato Institute doing that is because they don't care about gravity waves because they have no economic consequences. If gravity waves had an economic consequence, you could be sure that the Cato Institute would be fighting this, right? And then you would have a debate, and then you would have done a giant disservice to the American people by completely confusing them about a fact of science. So it's really, really important for all of us, as citizens, as listeners, for journalists who are covering these issues, to make a clear distinction between questions of scientific evidence, scientific facts, scientific conclusions, versus the policy discussion about what to do about it. You might even say, and some people have said, okay, well, I accept the science, but I just don't care. I don't care if sea level rises a meter or 3. I mean, you could say that, but I don't think most people would go on television and say that with a straight face. But that's the point. There's a distinction to be made, and it's an important distinction between the evidence of what's happening and what we may or may not want to do about it. And the mass media have done us a huge disservice by blurring that distinction. But of course, one of the reasons they've done that is because they've been pressured to do it. It's not just the media's fault. To some extent, the media are victims here, because a key part of the strategy that groups like the Cato Institute and other climate skeptic and denier groups use, and we documented this in our book, is they put pressure on the media to present the issue as a debate. They put pressure on the media to present both sides of the issue, even though from a scientific standpoint, that whole concept of both sides doesn't actually make any sense. So they impose a political model of both sides of an issue on what's essentially a scientific question, and in doing that, they create tremendous confusion. And what we showed in our book is that that's deliberate, that they want to create confusion. They want us to be confused about the issue because they know, and they've done market research to prove it, that if we're confused, we won't act. And so if you're trying to block action, one of the most effective things you can do to block action, one of the cheapest and easiest things you can do, is simply to get everybody to be confused. And that's the situation that has prevailed in the United States for the last 20 years. Public opinion polls have consistently showed that the American people have been quite confused about the science, and that that confusion correlates with ambivalence about action.